Welcome to Virtuosity's Fireside Chat. I'm Corey, one of the co-founders of Virtuosity, and I'm here with our other co-founder, Mary Crossan. A big thing that we focus on in Virtuosity is using evidence-based approaches in how we design programs. And one of the cornerstones of Virtuosity is that we rely on the leader-character framework, and that's what we're going to talk about today. If you are following along, we are going to provide a link to the leader-character framework, so you can click on that and follow along with the visuals as we work through describing it. So would you like to start us off on describing a little bit about what the leader character framework is?
Sure. Well, it might be helpful to say, where did it come from in the first place? In 2008, when we were looking at the failures of leadership arising from the economic crisis, and it was at that time in focus groups around the world that people began to talk about the importance of character. Yet people had all sorts of definitions about what character was. They didn't know whether you could develop it, and that set us really off on a journey to make sure that if we're going to elevate character alongside competence, that we were on a very robust base to be able to do it. Thankfully, we were really standing on the shoulders of giants. You take a look at Confucius, Aristotle, Plato, all of the great philosophers. And then in 2004, Seligman and Peterson had already established a framework on which we could begin to work with, identifying a set of character strengths that were universal in orientation. Now, these were applied at the individual level, mostly around well-being, and we discovered as we began to apply it in organizations that there were some gaps and some areas that we really had to do some course correction on. It took us about 6 years of engaged scholarship work building on the great theory and the practice side of things to establish a framework that was robust enough that we could actually do all the work we do today, which is how do you assess and develop character. So that's the background, Corey.
Yeah, that's really great. And so for people looking at the visual framework, there are 11 bubbles, so to call it. Do you want to work us through what those 11 bubbles are and how they work together?
Sure. So judgment is in the middle. It is what Aristotle would have described as practical wisdom. And this really helps us understand the whole idea of situational leadership and why this universal framework of character applies everywhere, because you're really talking about employing judgment in the midst of all of the kinds of decisions and actions that you take. Notice that there's these smaller words under each of the 11 dimensions, and those are the observable behaviors. And the gold standard in psychological research is actually us being able to observe these behaviors in another person. So if we take something like integrity, in the past people talk about valuing integrity, but we talk about that as like telling somebody to run a marathon and not train for it. Because those behaviors, being authentic, candid, transparent, consistent, and principled, are all behaviors that can be observed and can be developed. So those are the kind of the way the architecture of the framework works. Here is probably one of the most important facets, though. Aristotle talked about any one of these virtues operating in a vice in a vice state, either in deficiency or excess. If we say this another way, if you're going to have strength in something like integrity, and you don't want it to operate in its vice state, well, you're going to need a lot of humility and humanity to be able to support that. Otherwise, you just become quite arrogant about the principles that you have, very dogmatic, very rigid about what those pieces are. So those are the kind of really cornerstones, Corey, about how character operates.
And for those in case you aren't following along on the visual, I did want to point out the 11 dimensions that are around the wheel. So we have judgment in the middle, but then the other 10 dimensions are, let's see if I can memorize this offhand, accountability, courage, transcendence, in account, drive, collaboration, humanity, humility, integrity, which we've talked about, temperance, and justice. I got all of them. And when we do talk about all of those little observable behaviors, there's 62 of those. And when we apply that in Virtuosity, you can choose to focus on any of those 62 behaviors to focus on developing. And this virtues and vices piece that you're talking about, is really one of those underlying concepts that we always bring your attention to as you work through the behaviors, and it's understanding, are you more likely to exhibit that behavior in its virtuous state, or are you exhibiting it in its deficient state so that it's underdeveloped, or in its excess state so that you're looking to other behaviors to strengthen.
And Corey, I think the couple of conundrums about character, there's nobody thinks that we at least work with that thinks their character isn't good enough about it. But that's because we judge ourselves on our intentions and we judge others on their behavior, which is a big gap. And then we also have this problem that 85% of us believe we're self-aware and only 10 to 15% are. So when it comes to character, it's really easy not to really understand how your character is manifesting. And I think about this. I've been in this space for 15 years, and there's not a day that goes by that I actually don't begin to understand where I'm deficient around character and how what I thought was a strength is actually operating like a vice. So it's incredibly practical on a day-to-day basis.
And I want to share just a personal insight on how powerful I found the framework to be. And in sport, coming from my sport background, we would really focus on developing certain dimensions like drive and courage, and those things were really strong, and that would be the case for a lot of athletes. But what I was finding is that those strengths for me were operating as excess vices, and so my courage could become reckless, not knowing where my limits were, or my drive, seeking that striving for excellence, was turning into striving for perfection. And where the framework became really helpful for me is opening my eyes to all of these other behaviors like humility, integrity, humanity, that if I focused on strengthening those, that was actually better supporting my overall judgment and then therefore my performance and well-being, which actually makes me want to lead into another question with, we look at the framework and it's tied to judgment in the middle, but what does the framework help us do? What does it lead to ultimately?
There are two facets that we think about is well-being. How do you actually work through life on a daily basis with all of the challenges and opportunities, but to be able to do that with the strength of who you are and what you're about. The other, of course, is sustained excellence, and that really being about employing that judgment against all of the decisions and actions that you face to bring the most robust approach to how it is you operate on a daily basis. Another very interesting facet, though, Corey, is that while we think about it at the individual level, there is a character contagion, and we all begin to understand that we may be our better self around others who actually exhibit a lot of strength of character, and conversely, that our character can be eroded when we're around others that may be overweighting and underweighting some dimensions of character.
Yeah. And then one final piece I think that we'd like to talk about today is this universal approach to character. And I think when a lot of people hear it, it sounds quite bold to say that these virtues in this framework are universal. Could you share a little bit more about how that could be the case?
Right. I think the work around Peterson and Seligman setting up this set of criteria that would establish these behaviors as being virtuous in their strength state really helped us establish the fact that there may be, for example, cultures around the world that would put more emphasis on one dimension of character versus another. Nonetheless, it's still that all of these dimensions of character matter for great judgment and well-being. That we do know about it. And then I think the other part, Corey, that people begin to maybe get a bit confused about with it is that they say, well, won't we all be the same thing? Almost like these character robots about this. And that, of course, is not the case. I think for me, the ultimate around diversity and inclusion and being able to understand the uniqueness of who we are and how we become that person will manifest very differently in terms of the how we became that person who has a lot of collaboration or who has a lot of integrity, for example. So our stories are as unique as we are, and they all but then build towards trying to strengthen these muscles of character.
And I do love that the idea that these virtues are universal doesn't mean like you're saying, that they could be exhibited differently, especially when we look at different cultures. So one of my favorite examples is around humility, that one of the behaviors in the humility dimension in the framework is being respectful. And what we know is that respect can look different culture to culture. So in North America, we may show respect by making eye contact, whereas showing respect in different cultures could be avoiding eye contact. And so one thing in virtuosity that we encourage you to do right off the get-go is to actually understand what that virtue looks like for yourself, because that's quite different. And then it also asks you to explore what those virtues look like in other people. So it's really fun to start in that exploration stage because they will be unique from individual to individual.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything else you'd like to add on the leader character framework?
I think there's a lot that we've given people in
Mm-hmm.
this initial introduction. I'm sure we'll unpack a few more things as we go forward.
Yeah, and there is so much research out there. If you are hungry for more, there's lots of practitioner articles and research articles out there, and we will also link that in the description so you can continue to explore more. But hopefully that does give you a good understanding of the basics of the leader character framework, and we appreciate you tuning in for another Virtuosity Fireside Chat. Bye for now.